Okay, installment number 3, if you're following it chronologically, the way I posted it. So I talked a little bit about, in the last one, about my upbringing and that kind of stuff that kind of led me to that conversation with God here. And I think I covered all the high points. I went back and listened to it today, actually. I hadn't listened to it since I did it. I've had some interesting things going on lately. So actually I was pretty happy with kind of how it described it. And of course I read the first one about my experiences when I was in the hospital about 6 months ago, or probably 9 months now. And actually I thought I accurately described that too. So I felt pretty good about it. And like I said, I got some encouragement, with questions and that kind of thing. So I guess the next step is just to kind of continue with, what did I start to learn after I talked to God? So, again, this is the way my journey went. It doesn't have to be yours, but for me, I think one of the earliest things was I realized I didn't understand the nature of this three-dimensional reality. So if we're going to talk about understanding things, we should understand, things that we can see and feel and taste and that kind of thing. So I had never taken a physics course, but I decided to read, and I'll try to give you references to stuff I read or saw, but I read Stephen Hawking's book, A Briefer History in Time, and then I probably reread it, and then, but the concepts, he wrote it so well that the concepts were, understandable, if you will, and led to, way more questions from where he left off, essentially. And, so I started to learn physics, which makes sense. I mean, people are scared of trying to learn something they don't think they can, but physics is just an attempt to describe the nature of the physical environment around us. So I did. That book really helped for me to understand the basics of, especially relativistic physics, Einstein's general relativity, or I don't think it's special relativity, I always forget that, but kind of understanding the basics. And here's a working knowledge of physics that probably anybody can understand, even though I would go way deeper than this. But all matter that we know of is pretty much made up of atoms, except particles that are either unseen or just, they're usually smaller than an atom. So an atom actually is a pretty simple thing, which, when you get down to it, it's kind of weird. So all matter is made up of atoms that, build structures, we'll put it that way. And the atoms are made up of 3 things, and that's a neutron, a proton, and an electron. The neutron and the protons are where all the mass is in the center of the atom, and the electron stays in what they call shells, I believe, outside the nucleus. And I think I actually learned that in middle school science, but I was like, okay, sounds random, but okay, the basis form of matter are these balls of atoms, and okay, I can buy that. And, I learned a little bit about chemistry, I guess, then, although I went back and picked up on chemistry too, because that was a subject that I kind of avoided, when I should have been learning it in school. But you basically build from an atom up to molecules, and then larger and larger structures like planets and stars and galaxies and galactic clusters and so forth. But relativistic physics works pretty well. There's still some stuff, there's some infinities you run into, but it does pretty well describing that, to most people's satisfaction. We don't know it all, which is evident by the fact that we don't really know what dark matter and dark energy are. And that makes up, I believe, an estimated 95% of everything in the universe. So obviously we don't know it all, but we're pretty good on matter. And then energy, of course, is the other form of matter, which Einstein's famous equals mc squared, I think it was named before that, but Einstein took it one step further and determined that time and space are connected, and that time can be affected by forces such as gravity. And there's a famous experiment when they take 2 atomic clocks and they set them at I think they're probably sea level, and then they draw and they sink them to make sure, I mean, to the gajillionth percentage of a second that they're synced, and they take one of them up to a higher elevation and bring it back, and they won't be on the same time. Now, if they would set next to each other, they would have been, but the effect of having less gravity at higher elevations means that time runs differently. So you start to learn things like that, and you're like, wow, that's pretty weird. Tell me more. So, like I said, the atom is understanding kind of the basic building blocks, and there are 4 known forces in physics, in the relativistic world anyway. There's 3, I guess, in the quantum world, but you've got electromagnetism, which is fascinating. It includes light, it includes electricity. It's the one force we've probably not tamed, but we've tapped into to build a civilization, because no electricity, no internet, right? So that's the force we probably use the most. Now the other 3, one is gravity, which gravity is interesting. It's supposedly there's a force carrier of a graviton, but then I'm like, that doesn't seem right. Maybe it's just stretching space-time. But you can go down some rabbit holes with gravity too. Gravity's very interesting. It's how we know there's dark matter out there, because of how fast some of these galaxies are spinning, kind of like the Milky Way, that if there wasn't more mass, these stars would be flying out into space based on their velocity and the amount of mass that's towards in the gravitational center of those galaxies. So when you start to kind of, like I say, you kind of start to say, okay, I can see, you learn the standard cosmological model or theory that there's plenty of evidence for, that the world, or the universe, is about 13.7 billion years old as we understand time, and which is funny because that's based on Earth years. When even when you're trying to, it's kind of funny to measure the scope of the universe using earthly measurements. But so when you start to learn that stuff, and Einstein, like I said, he took it one step further, with understanding how time and space, and really he was ahead of his time, obviously, because some of the stuff he couldn't prove, it was theoretical, but they did a famous solar eclipse experiment that showed that light did bend around the gravitational bounds of the moon, or I think it was, I can't remember, it was a solar eclipse, and I think they were looking at starlight behind it, and they could tell that it curved. So Einstein was right, on that. He was right about a lot of stuff. And but while relativistic physics was going on, that was basically adding on to Newton and some of the principles, of all the scientists in the past. There's another group of physics going on in the quantum world, which looks at reality of the physical environment at less than atomic sizes. So, like I said, an atom's pretty easy, right? It's a proton, neutron, and electrons, flying around outside of it. But the quantum world is looking at the things that make up that neutron and that proton, and the characteristics of that tiny little electron that's, a different charge than the protons, and watching it do its thing, and why it, does its thing when it interacts with higher levels of energy, or, again, you can learn as much as you want. It's there's plenty of sources out there. And Hawking covered some quantum principles, if you will. But really, there's by that point, when I really was getting deep into quantum physics, I had access to, I think it was MIT's or somebody's college lectures. So if I was, looking to figure out something, I would just Google that term and, find it or whatever, wherever it is, and where one of the greatest professors in the world, like I said, I think it was MIT, but they could explain things so well. There was a reason why that person was probably teaching at an institution for the best minds, but so I could understand it, and there's a lot to understand. The protons and neutrons break into other parts, and this is where you get into particle physics, where muons, gluons, there's a bunch of different things, quarks, And all these pieces do different things for, you know, have kind of different functions. And it's, you know, it obviously it gets complicated. And actual particle physics at one point, they were very confused because they were finding all these other particles, and they're like, well, something is running amok here. So but I think, you know, they finally figured it out. You know, what'll be the next smallest thing after that? Who knows? But you know, they've kind of gotten down to, you know, trying to get to Planck size, you know, scales here. So anyway, when I jumped over into quantum physics and really trying to understand it, the best part that you want to study to dip your toe in it is the double slit experiment, because that demonstrates how reality is different at the quantum world versus at the relativistic world, you know, atom size and above. And I could explain it, but I would butcher it better than, you know, somebody who has a degree in physics. But the main takeaway from this experiment was, one, particles don't follow straight lines, and even when they're flying through the probability of one or two slits, there's some other motion or wave. And what it turns out to be, not to ruin the ending, but they saw the same pattern in interference patterns, and they saw the same pattern in wave functions, water. So they kind of had seen the patterns before, but they're like, why would these tiny little particles, why wouldn't they just fly along, you know, a straight line and go through one slit or the other and just be two marks on the wall versus an interference pattern? And I guess, you know, I was following along with this, and look, I'm a skeptic, and I'm thinking about this experiment, and I'm like, well, maybe they're pushing each other as they go through these two slits. And that's why, you know, it's looking like a wave or whatever, but they're just really bumping into each other. But then they fired single particles through these two slits, one at a time. And the interference pattern persisted, which I'm like, now wait a minute. There's one particle. You're shooting it through two slits onto the back wall. How does one particle interfere with itself, right? You're not shooting it through gravitational portals or anything. You're shooting it through windows, essentially. And you can do this experiment at home, actually. Go get a laser and probably spend some money and recreate it. But so, okay, that's all cool. So obviously, you know, matter acts differently at the quantum scales. But then taking another step forward, they found out that if you put a detector on the slits, so you observe it, you don't interfere with it, but you observe it, then they just choose one or the other, and they form a different pattern on the wall. Now, all you're doing is observing this with a detector, right? Like I said, the physicists can describe it better, but the bottom line is a conscious thought, which is to observe, affects the nature of matter at the smallest scales. And I mean, this affects a lot of things, like light. You know, photons are kind of in this as well. So that was very interesting, man. And I started thinking, I mean, gosh, what else is out there? Like, why isn't this kind of put on, you know, like a national question? Does anybody know the answer to this kind of thing? We should be looking into this. And that was kind of my stepping off point. I understood that, you know, I needed to, you know, take a step back and say, if I'm going to learn these things, you know, I've got to open my mind to know that, you know, if consciousness interacts with particles at the quantum scale, what else interacts with consciousness? And does it happen just on the quantum scale? So down the rabbit hole you go. And that's the thing, is you learn stuff, the damnable aspect of learning things, it usually you get another 6 questions from the implications of what you learned, and you're like, whoa, this could be possible. And I think I remember somebody, you know, talking about this possibility. Let me learn more about, you know, like near-death experiences. Like I said, when you've got to, you know, study all the evidence, and there's going to be hoaxing, and there's going to be not even intentional hoaxing. Scientists make mistakes. I mean, Hawking was wrong about, conservation of information at first on black holes, but, he figured it out eventually. But, you know, it's time to look at all phenomena and figure out, if this physics doesn't work, or either of these physics don't work, then let's look there too. The other piece I talked about I didn't talk about the strong force, which is also an amazing thing, which basically bonds the nucleus of atoms together, because they're both, if they're positively charged, they should repel each other. But this strong force, for some reason, which is a pretty amazing force, that's another one if we could lock into and just break atoms apart and rebuild them, that would be a breakthrough with the strong force, right? Like I said, we use the electromagnetic force, and we kind of understand gravity. And then the weak forces, it's important, learn it, because there's only 4 of them, so don't be lazy. But, it's a little bit less interesting, although, who knows, maybe I'll learn something tomorrow that talks about the weak force, and it'll be the link to unified physics, who knows. But, so, I guess in around 2017, the government released those F-18 videos of those Tic Tacs from a 2004 incident off of San Diego or San Francisco or somewhere off down there on the southern part of California. And as I'm watching this, I'm thinking, these cameras and equipment that are tracking this stuff is some of the most sophisticated. It's military grade, and this was a aircraft carrier task force. So this wasn't like one ship out there. This had multiple ships with multiple radars, along with a ship that was designed to be super radar powerful to protect, the defense of the task force. I mean, they were training. It wasn't, or they were just on a regular tour out there. And so the videos got released, and I'm looking, and I'm hearing people talk about an analysis. Now, I try to go with the experts as much as I can, So if you're going to learn physics, then learn, learn from Einstein and, Hawking and Bohr and, Newton and all of the scientists. But when you're talking about more metaphysical things, that's what I'm going to call this. And that, to me, metaphysics is just another way of saying we don't understand how the hell this stuff happens. So these blue jays are starting to howl. You might hear my owl here in a minute. So when I saw those videos, I said, this data doesn't match with what I know about physics, because by that point I had already taken a deeper dive of physics, and I understand how gravity works and how things like at that speed, momentum, this isn't deep physics, but they shouldn't be able to make right turns, and there should be some visible signs of propulsion, be it heat. But they actually had, like I said, this was the most sophisticated equipment to analyze this stuff. They knew that the temperature of these Tic Tacs were actually lower than the ambient outside. I don't think I'm misremembering that. So, which is an odd thing for something that's going 35,000 miles an hour and making left and right turns, and actually going, according to witness, they didn't show everything. I'm sure there's plenty of video out there that they confiscated. But what they did release was, they also, the guys that were tracking them with like I said, they had the task of defending the task force with a radar cover, and I'm sure they were tapped into, missile frigates or whatever. But anyway, they testified to a couple of different, shows or investigators or whatever, and what they confirmed was, look, I'm sorry, there's no other answer other than, especially in 2004. Like, if we had this technology in 2004. Again, I don't want to go down the rabbit hole, but it was pretty clear that this wasn't, technology that was in line with any civilizations we know of on Earth, and likely was maybe from, out somewhere besides Earth. So it got me thinking, okay, look, extraterrestrials was one of the big questions I asked God about, are we alone? And, here comes the evidence, right? So, don't be dumb. Don't fall for, one view of things. Look at it from all angles. Find a debunker that tries to debunk it and see if his story makes sense. And I did, actually, and it did not make sense. The guy was like, this could have been a balloon. And I'm like, dude, I don't think so. We didn't even we couldn't even see a giant meteorological balloon that was flying over the country until it was over the center of it. Um, his explanation didn't make, with all due respect. I mean, he really, but talking to like pilots and that kind of thing that interacted with it, you should do. They most of them have testified about what they did and saw. So, okay, that opens up. We're not alone, probably, unless there's one other possibility that maybe future people are coming back, because we know time is like I was trying to teach you earlier, is a little bit flexible based on certain criteria. But we're not alone from a conscious standpoint. So there are other conscious beings besides Earth. I mean, if you look at the scales of the universe, it would be very arrogant of us Earthlings to think we were alone and we're the only ones to have evolved over the last 3.5 billion years, if we're talking about when Earth was formed, so, or when there was life on Earth. So, but anyway, so if that's the case, then if there's one, well, if there's one, there's probably more, right? And things that I thought that we would never know because of the distances of the universe. Well, I started to learn things about portals and time and later I learned more about some conscious beings may even be able to project themselves interdimensionally to have an encounter with somebody here on Earth. I mean, there's a lot of strange things, and most of it is described mathematically, so it's not like it's impossible. It's just mainly theoretical, but so was Einstein's when he first wrote it, and others. So anyway, I went down that rabbit hole, and the hardest one for the government to have covered up was Roswell, so that's the one you hear about the most. But look, don't think that there was only one or two incidents where we either shot something out of the sky or something crashed, or we found historical crashes from, who knows, thousands of years ago. The possibilities are endless once you get to that point where you understand, we're not, the organic people born here on this earth may not be the only ones that come here or stay here or visit here. So, once you start to understand, and then look, is there evidence for it? I mean, good grief, there's UFO sightings over, our nuclear defense missiles that actually turned 10 of them off that weren't even connected to one another. Unless that commander and the other witnesses that, corroborated that story is a bald-faced liar, then look, that wasn't our enemies that did that. That was sophisticated technology that was well beyond, I forget what year it was, but it was well beyond. But these things are, they're here. They visit. They seem to be drawn to things like volcanoes, certain volcanoes, but they're sighted everywhere. And now we live in the age of the cell phone, right? The personal device, I like to think of it. We shouldn't even call it cell phones anymore. So people take them out and take pictures of what they see, and these things appear in visible light, which can be captured by a phone. And then, we're left to try to, explain them, especially when they don't seem to make any sense in conventional, thought. So you can see how, the rabbit hole started expanding from, is there aliens coming here? Yes, there was, again, so much evidence for it. The biggest question for me on the alien piece is, why does our government seem to not want to tell us? And to me, that's a job for the top, right? That's the chief executive officer should be going, hey, if we've got evidence of, alien life, let me hear it. I'm the chief executive of who governs, at least in the United States. And I think presidents have tried, and there's been some weird things, with Carter and Eisenhower in particular, and so. But you can go learn that stuff. It's it's out there if you want to dive into it. And some stuff has more evidence than others. But then things that kind of happen around that timeline tend to give it credence, and people are curious. They're always, if something looks different, they're going to catch it, and they're catching it more and more, which is pretty cool. So I read a book about the Rendlesham incident in England, which was I think it was a U.S. base, but it was in England, and well documented. The guy carried a recorder with him as he was chasing this UFO through the woods, and by guy I mean a colonel at this base. And this was a nuclear capable base too. It was nuclear storage, which wasn't known at the time. But this thing reportedly may have been interested in reading what was there, maybe nuclear weapons wise. I think the higher evolved conscious beings are a little concerned that we're going to blow each other up, which is a valid concern. So, but it looks like, there's things like that. And like I said, if you listen to the tape recording or a reading of the tape recording, you'll get the idea of the panic and of these guys were like, what the hell's going on? There's this shouldn't, this breaks reality, if you don't believe in extraterrestrial things. And, but a lot of people have an experience, and then all of a sudden it's all too real. And usually, I hope, most in a positive way, but there's been some negative ones too. And you got to listen to all the testimony that you can to really start putting the dots together. Don't limit it to just one source. Don't even limit it to just your country. Get information that was outside of your country, outside of your religious upbringing, outside of your civilization, whatever country you're in. You got to think bigger and broader. I love history. That I've always loved and fascinated by. And because this stuff really happened. So it's, fascinating. So I'm a big student of history. Anytime I can learn a chunk of history that I've never learned before. But part of this journey brought me to understanding, the cultures of India and the far, the East, if you will, Buddhism and Hinduism, which are very interesting. They're more philosophy than religion in a way, but they do in some ways have spiritual heads. But you should learn that. If you're not learning that, then you're probably doing yourself an injustice. If you want to learn, things, because these folks kind of are ahead of you already on a spiritual journey because it's a different culture there. I've learned the most about India, and these gurus. I mean, they can do things, kind of Jesus biblical things that are described in the Bible, are the same thing that these gurus can do, which I found fascinating. And like I said, I hadn't given up on Jesus as somebody that should be worshipped, if you will. Maybe he should be. He probably should. And I was okay with that. Like I said, I'm not anti-religion. If you're a Christian, I'm kind of more of a Gnostic Christian, I guess. But when I studied the Indian culture, they were well aware of Jesus. They revered him in he's revered in Hinduism, and they have records of him traveling there. So, one of the things that always bugged me about the Bible was, I think it covered him until he was about 12, and it was pretty sketchy after, he was born. There wasn't a lot of information. And then he kind of came back into the picture at age 30, and he was doing miracles and healing people and walking on water and making bread loaves divide. I mean, these are all things that, when you read about as a kid or as you're learning Christianity, you're like, wow, that's amazing. I mean, just healing people alone. And it's a very honorable power to have, And so if I knew if his story was any close to being accurate of what was in the Bible, Jesus was an amazing person, or lived an amazing life, I guess is the way I look at it now. And he's still here. By here, I mean in the universe and in the all. And people, I think, do communicate with Jesus. I'm convinced of that. And he's been a shoulder for a lot, and as has Buddha, as has the Indian, the figures kind of in Indian culture, and I don't want to butcher it because I do revere it, so I don't want to get it wrong. But start to learn some of that philosophy, and then you'll learn quickly about things like reincarnation. And if you want proof of reincarnation, you don't necessarily have to go to India. You can go to near-death experiencers here in the Western world. And a lot of their stories are consistent. It's not everybody that dies and comes back. And by die, usually we're talking, heart or brain stops. But there's a consistency in these testimonies, and it changes people's lives, which is real. I mean, I don't think these people are lying about a life-changing experience. I know I never would. But, like I said, there could be, hoaxers out there, but these people, look in their eyes as they're telling the story. I listen to a lot of them on a podcast. Next Level Soul is, if you want to really learn about how God is love, and all of this, this a lot more about this reality. Find a podcast like that one. I recommend that one, Next Level Soul, and hear what these people have to say and listen to them. Don't let what they look like. I started listening to a guru called Sad Guru, which I think I later learned it meant something, and I can't remember what it means now, but as a Westerner, we're seeing a guy in a preview. Now here I'm wearing a baseball cap and a blue teal shirt, but I saw his appearance and I was like, oh boy, I'm listen to this guy, but he doesn't look like anything I've ever anybody I've ever listened to before. I'll put it that way, which is a very, very wrong way to look at things, and I learned very quickly. So I started listening to just his lectures or his meditations. I think I was really trying to learn how to meditate as best. But I ran across these gurus, obviously, because they're great at it. And everything this guy said rang true to me, that's unusual. That doesn't happen much in life. And usually it's innocent, Usually they just misremember something. But I hear people say wrong things, or now I look at it more from an ego or a fear point of view, and I'm thinking, ooh, that's I don't think you're on the right frequency with that thought. You know what I mean? But it's not my job to try to nitpick every thought that comes out. I probably do that enough with my friends and family, but I studied near-death experiencers. And they were describing, where you go afterwards and how you separate the body. And there was all these, the silver cord seemed to be, persistent. I wanted to learn about near-death experiences from other cultures than mine, so I can see, what was the same, what was different, and what did that mean if there were differences. And it was fascinating. And at some point, I discovered Dolores Cannon. I'd read a book about past life regression. So I was starting to say, okay, this is looking more and more like it makes a lot more sense that our lives are only 100 years versus the scale of the universe if we have multiple lives. Or, at some point you start questioning, is this base reality, or is base reality a higher dimension? And this is a place we temporarily come to, which, again, there's a lot of evidence for that as well. So Dolores Cannon became one of the leading researchers on past life regression. She's got an interesting story. You should read it. She's passed now, I believe, but she did an amazing research, and she was really able to, without influencing what the people were saying, to just objectively get information from them and then go back and try to confirm what they're saying was actual historical fact. If you really want to if you want to start about past lives, Dorothy Eady, E-A-D-Y, I know is her last name. I might be getting that first name wrong, but she was born in England, and I won't ruin the story, but you'll learn a lot about, previous lives from her, because the things that she knew was impossible for her to have known. And there was really only one explanation, is that she was telling the truth. She did live in ancient Egypt, because she knew where the buildings were buried. She knew where the bodies were buried. Well, buildings. And she became the head of Egypt's Egyptology, I guess, study. And she never deviated from her story about living in those times, and was able to see, I don't know if she saw everything, but could see glimpses of her life back then. And it was fascinating. And then again, Dolores Cannon, with past life regression started, and I think she did just a really good job. I think Brian Weiss also wrote a book about past life regression. I started him, but to me, I like Dolores Cannon's. I just liked her. She was an amazing lady, and I think the best book she wrote was Jesus and the Essenes, which I read the whole thing, and that helped reconnect me back to Jesus being maybe just as special as we thought he was, just maybe in a different way. And because she describes somebody she was taking under past life regression that lived in the time of Jesus and met him as a child, where he was studying at a school, which was where the Essenes were. and kind of just describing his nature, his manner, and I believe his cousin John the Baptist was there too, and then this consciousness or this lifetime that lived with him came back, even though he had passed away. He came back to view the crucifixion, which I found fascinating, because she's asking this person questions under not hypnosis, but yeah, I guess you could call it that. But trying to have her go back through her memories of that lifetime. But part of the memories was after this guy died, he went back to view the crucifixion of Jesus, and he described it in his own way. And I was fascinated by that. And she wrote another book about Jesus, where I think a woman ran into him when he was in Jerusalem, pretty close to, before he passed, and described an interaction with him, which I found was amazing. And so, things that you thought you never could prove, and why bother studying? People have been living around here for a long time and accumulating knowledge, and after we had the ability to write and convey thought from the past to the future, we can learn a lot. There's a lot of data out there. And so that's where I went next. And I probably should cut it off here. I know I want to talk about my spirit guys. I know there's a lot of questions about that and her. And like I said, most of this happened, she probably came into play more a couple of years ago versus back to 2017, because it's 2023 now. And I promise I will cover that. And the out-of-body experiences, which were pretty interesting, especially the first one that I knew I was out of body in. And I will tell that story too. And I didn't cover, poltergeist and residual energy in old places that may have experienced trauma, but that stuff, there's evidence for it. Whether going back to quantum physics, where our consciousness is causing, an echo of an emotional moment and somebody else's life appear, and now we can actually register it, or sometimes they may be intelligent spirits, if you will, in poltergeist. And I mean, there's, like I said, everybody has a camera in their hand now, so like I'm doing right now. So there's a lot of evidence for that. Paranormal calling, it was funny, I was meditating, I'm like, okay, this is back when I used to challenge, about teaching me faster, but I'm like, or I was still pretty skeptical at the time, and I'm like, if these things exist, like if metaphysical things happen, if everybody's got a phone, then we should have lots of evidence in this day and age. And sure enough, there's a show called, there's a bunch of shows, but Paranormal Caught on Camera was, like when I Googled it, it was like, yeah, go ahead and Google that. I was having, that probably, my spirit guide was probably there at that time. And Paranormal Caught on Camera, right? It's in the title. So I watched, many seasons of that too. And you start to see patterns in there, and you start to understand, maybe what's going on based on, what people feel and say and experience. And it all starts to make sense. There's nothing super scary in my opinion. I'm not, I don't even believe in the devil. I think this is the closest we get to hell, which is pretty amazing, because this is an amazing place. There's evil here, but there's so much love and all of that here as well. I wouldn't trade a day, for this journey. But I think I'm going to cut it off there, because I've got to head out to have dinner with friends. So it's been an interesting week. My folks have had some challenges this week, so but I'm glad to be back here. It feels good to just kind of talk to the woods once more. And I hope everybody out there is having a beautiful, fantastic day. This is mid-September, and it couldn't be nicer weather, and couldn't be more beautiful out here. So peace and love to all.